Hope you're having a really good day with all the sessions and getting things done. So I'm really excited about this session. I love talking about working with families, particularly because I feel like often as teachers, it's a learning curve. You have your first parent-teacher conferences like with real parents, or you have your first IEP meeting with real parents. And we may not be used to their advocacy style and things like that. And so often when it comes to parents of color, often they're seen as abrasive or muted, or just different, biases come with different groups, right, that are perpetuating our society. So I'm really excited to kind of talk about thinking about our work in collaborating with families and thinking about what we're teaching if we are working with teacher candidates, or if we're in classrooms, what's the work that we're doing. So I'm going to share my screen with you all. Okay, I think you all can see that. So there's going to be multiple times where I'm just going to pause and ask you to either write in the chat or unmute, because it's only a few of us, because I would love your perspectives. I'm going to just talk a little bit in the beginning to kind of orient our conversation and to think about a framework that we can potentially use to really think about whether our practices that we're either teaching or engaging in really disrupt inequity in terms of families of color. So I named this session Building Collaborative Relationships with Families of Color, particularly because I've been grappling with language. And so as educators, I think we always grapple with language, but what does it mean and how language, can you hear me? Sorry. How language is being used. And so in order to disrupt perspectives of deficit, we often have to think about how language is used in our society and how that might impact how we use that language in schools. So I'm going to ask you to either write in the chat or unmute, because I love to hear your voices. What comes to mind when you hear the word support or collaborate? And do you think these words are similar or different? Why or why not? I'll go back. And I can see you all.
I know no, you go, Kara.
No, I was just going to say, well, I think they're different, right?
Okay.
Because collaborate assumes that two people have expertise. Maybe they're not the same, but they're equal, and they're each going to contribute to a process. Support implies that one person is supporting another person in a particular way or in a particular area. That's just what came to mind first for me.
Thank you so much. Lauren, did you want to add? Or did you have similar perspectives, different?
I think similar, where like in not so much the expertise, but I think of collaborate as like both working together, right? To either come up with a solution or work together. And support is really providing, I always think of as like one person providing the supports for someone else, right? So not necessarily as equal of a footing, but support being provided to other people.
Oh, thank you. Any other perspectives?
My thought on this, when you say support, it makes me think of like my family and their support, but collaborate is like what I would do professionally with others.
Okay. So thinking of different contexts where you associate support and collaborate. Thank you. Any additional thoughts? Okay, so let's move forward with some of those thoughts on the table. What I would like us to think about is how these words support and collaborate manifest in schools and society. So when we think about families of color, they're typically marginalized in our society, whether it's in the field of education, healthcare, corrections, etc., right? And often when we use the word support and we're associating with families of color, we typically think about support as providing access. Usually support has this hierarchy. So the person with access is providing for the person without access. Typically it's monovocal. So meaning that usually the person who has access is the voice that we hear typically most of the time. Usually the person with access dominates airtime, right? Because they're explaining, this is what you need to do. This is how I can help you. This is where the resources are, etc. And usually there's one view dominating, and it's typically the person who's providing the support because they have the access, right? Collaboration, when we think about how we use collaboration in contrast to support, we think about equal access to a space, to a conversation. We also think about working together, as you all mentioned, as a team to attend to a project, to an issue or a problem. It's multivocal, meaning that since there's equal access, every voice at the table is being heard and considered. There's shared airtime and there's shared understanding. So often when I think about families that are marginalized in schools, typically families of color, low-income families, linguistically diverse families of color, culturally diverse families of color, single parents, typically women of color, are typically the folks who are doing advocacy work in schools, and non-traditional families of color. So we typically say that we're supporting them because they may lack resources. They're resource poor, which has been used in our society. And typically those resources are thought of around food, shelter, clothing, etc. Right? But what I want to argue is that in our society, we have a very limited definition of what resource is or what resources are. And we typically use that to think about what people need financially or don't have financially. And what I want to argue is that when we focus on this very limited view of resources, one, we approach our work from a perspective of deficit, and two, we can completely negate the multitude of resources that our families possess. So although they may not have financial resources, we need to think really creatively about the type of resources that they do have, right? And not that we're ignoring their need for shelter, for food, for clothing, etc., but we're thinking about that also with an asset frame towards what they also do have, right? So just thinking about the research and the impacts, when we approach families from a deficit perspective, these are the kind of things that happen in schools, which research has demonstrated happens, right? When they go to IP meetings, because that's what I focus on, parents find the process difficult, complicated, confusing, and frustrating. Parents receive minimal amount of support. When they're provided with information, it's difficult for them to understand. We use jargon, which is exclusionary and alienates parents. We dominate discussions and decision-making and often exclude parents' concerns, and that limits parents' participation as equal partners. Parents have participated in meetings where they're ignored, their suggestions are not considered, and they're openly criticized. So if we take the perspective of supporting families, and we're coming from a deficit perspective, then our voices are more important, right? Because we have the access, we have the resources that you all need, right? Additionally, parents feel intimidated. Latino parents have said that they have high expectations for their children, but they lack the knowledge and skills to advocate effectively. Parents may feel ill-equipped and therefore concede to our expertise. Misunderstandings of how culturally and linguistically diverse families, their values and how they participate, meaning, in some families, in some Caribbean families, we particularly in my culture, so my family's from Trinidad, we see teachers as people with expertise and knowledge. And so we often defer to them. And it doesn't mean that we don't have things to say, but we really value teachers. Linguistically diverse parents express feelings of disrespect when personnel arrive late or leave early. And they've expressed a desire that we listen to them. We develop effective communication. We increase their knowledge, right, about various disabilities. We demonstrate sensitivity. We demonstrate respect and meeting their children's needs. And if you look at these resources, they range from 1986 to 2017. So this is an issue that has been in our schools for a very long time, right? If you look across all these studies, right? And so if we take this perspective, this deficit perspective of support, if we're thinking about it from a deficit perspective, then we have all of these issues that we've seen throughout our history here, in terms of how parents of color feel when they are trying to engage with supporting their students. So I'd like us to take a different lens. And so I want to quote some text from Yasso's article around community cultural wealth. She says, a critical race theory lens can see that communities of color nurture cultural wealth through at least 6 forms of capital, such as aspirational, navigational, social, linguistic, familial, and resistant capital. These various forms of capital are not mutually exclusive or static, but rather are dynamic processes that build on one another as part of community cultural wealth. And they provide an example. She says, aspirational capital is the ability to hold on to hope in the face of structured inequality and often without the means to make such dreams a reality. Yet, aspirations are developed within social and familial contexts, often through linguistic storytelling and advice, consejos, that offer specific navigational goals to challenge or resist oppressive conditions. So what I'd like us to do is look at the community cultural wealth model. And I would like you all to share just, I know I said a lot, your perspectives on what I've said, if you have any comments, but also your perspective, just as you just read through this model, how helpful you think this might be for you, your teacher candidates, in your teaching, or your teacher candidates as they learn about supporting families. And as Kara says, like, families are rich in resources and teachers and schools need to help children to be successful in school. Like, that's our work, right? So any thoughts on this model as you read through?
Just Ebony, I was saying families are rich in the resources that teachers and schools need. So
that teachers and schools need, sorry.
Like,
yeah.
We need the resources that they have, like their knowledge of their child. They very often are rich in resources in terms of social networks and community and their values and all this information that we really need, even in just getting to know children. So I like where you're going with this, to kind of flip this idea. I might be getting ahead of your story, but support, wouldn't that be a beautiful thing if we realize that we need the families to support us, that we are reliant on them to be more successful.
Yeah. So the word itself doesn't have like a negative or positive connotation, like, you know what I'm saying? But it's how we then use it when we're in schools, right? That's how, language is very interesting. So we say support, and often we only think about particular types of resources that families don't have that we're giving, right? When support can be something like, we're supporting each other, we're collaborating, we're helping each other, but often it's not used like that in school. So yes, yeah. Really, really important point. Any other thoughts about this model? Or in general, what I've shared?
I know, and I appreciate your help, Ebony, because I work with a lot of our teacher candidates, and I think helping them to kind of reframe their thinking or some of the language that they hear in some of their placements to help really use this model to then kind of frame their interactions and frame their perspectives on parents and on their students. That's what I found has been the most helpful, is using this language and being able to apply this framework to alter the deficit thinking that I find that there's some newer kind of teacher candidates just default to. Right. And changing that narrative and giving them this frame to then guide their thinking and then their strategies and their implementation, right? We need to guide the thinking first before then we can impact the behavior. And that's what I think has been so powerful for me, is to then give them this frame to help guide their kind of interpretation.
Yeah, totally. And I think, and I mean, think about it like this. Our teacher candidates, like, they weren't teachers, they were students. And so they just take in, it's the apprenticeship of observation, right? You think you know what it means to be a teacher or how to run a classroom because you've observed it your whole life, right? But what they don't notice is that they often take up, a lot of societal biases that they've actually taken up in school or from their experiences and things like that. And then those biases kind of seep into how they see schools, right? But the thing is, it's like, there's no one between them being students and being a teacher to say, oh, hey, like, we need to critically analyze your experiences. I mean, that's where we come in, right? As teacher educators, to say, oh, let's think critically about some assumptions that you have about what students can do, or what parents can or cannot do. And let's figure out a framework that we can use to undergird and have the language around. I think I've been thinking about this, it's like having students look at video, having our pre-service teachers look at video and only focus on the capital. Because the first thing that we always do, especially because we're special educators, is like, okay, how do they need help? How can we help them? Right. But if we focus on the capital, then we can leverage capital to help students in classrooms, right? And we can leverage capital that families have to understand our students in classrooms, right? And we can also leverage that capital to understand the kind of advocacy practices that parents engage in. So I'm looking at from a capital perspective first, actually broadens our view, makes it more holistic, right? Instead of jumping to saying like, oh, there's a problem, I need to solve it, right? As an educator. So thank you so much, Lauren. So I wanted us to think a bit about the practices that we engage in, or we prepare our pre-service teachers or teacher candidates to engage in. And so I felt like this might be a place where we can have some conversation and get some ideas from each other on things we can do in our classrooms or we can do as teachers. So the questions I want us to think about is, what practices I engage in if you're currently a teacher, or teach if you're a teacher educator, that supports collaborating in equitable ways with families of color? And what type of capital does that strategy highlight or draw upon, right? And then if it doesn't draw upon capital, how might we modify or change our practices to uplift these forms of capital? So for example, one thing that I have thought about is using video of students in classrooms, and with maybe a teacher, a special education teacher, working one-on-one with the student, and then having my teacher candidates focus in on the type of capital that we see that the student is sharing, or the parent, if it's a parent-teacher conference, is sharing. And so I've been really thinking about engaging that next semester in supporting my teacher candidates in two high leverage practices, which is building relationships, and the other one is communicating with families. And I think we could use video to really think of how pre-service teachers think about the kind of capital that they may not readily see because they haven't been thinking in that perspective. So that's one idea that I have that I'd like to implement next semester in my course. Oh, so Mary says, takes me back to the support versus collaborative. Support needs to be informed by families, by families' thoughts, and them saying what they need, right? So thinking about what families need, and for us to be, informed by them. So any particular practices that you all teach or that you all engage in that take up or draw upon any of the capital that families have. Okay, so I'll share something with you because I actually have some ideas, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited about next semester. There's some things I want to do, so I want to share those with you. And if any ideas come to you all, feel free to stop me, and we can chat. Okay, so when I was teaching at the University of Michigan, when I engaged in my dissertation study, I taught a class called Teaching Students with Exceptionalities in Middle and High School. And what I have my pre-service teachers do is engage in simulations of an IEP meeting. Now, these are general educators. And what I noticed as a teacher, that general educators, they come to meetings, but they don't seem very involved in the special education process very deeply. And I was wondering about that. And what was interesting to me is that when I talk to general educators, sometimes they say, well, I don't have a lot of knowledge. I took one class, I don't know. Or I don't really know how I can participate or help, right? I just come, I read my grades, that's it, right? And so for me, in thinking about working with general educators, I said, okay, well, in order to be an active part of the process, right, you need to also have these collaborative tendencies, right? So there's some things that you need to do as general educators. You need to be able to share knowledge of student. You have the student in your classroom, your general education classroom. You should know about your student. You need to be able to listen. You need to be able to hear what parents are saying. You need to be able to revoice what they're saying, right? And you also need to be able to elicit. If there are things that you don't know, you can ask, right? And this allows you to connect what you know, right, about the student with what parents know, right? But in order to really be collaborative, you have to demonstrate flexibility. That means that you might have a parent who's like, nah, I don't agree with what you're saying. We're not doing that, right? And how to think about what the parent is saying and what you know, and come to a middle ground, being flexible, right? And understanding that the parent has something to share and has knowledge that might inform your work. Also, that you need to collaborate with the other people in the room. So you're not the only one interacting with the parent, but you're also interacting with the special educator, the social worker, the psychologist, the chairperson of special education, et cetera. And then if you have knowledge of resources or things that can support the student, advocate for those things, right? It may be on a district level, it may be in your school, et cetera. And once they engage in these practices, then they can contribute. They can recommend appropriate programming, suggest resources, and follow up with the parent, right? And so in thinking about this, you would say, Ebony, isn't that what we're supposed to do anyway? Right? And I'll say yes, but if we look at the experiences of parents of color, we're not doing these things for them, right? And research has demonstrated that, and parents have said that. And so my goal was to break down the things that we need to do really specifically. So my students are like, okay, I need to be able to know my student very well. I need to listen. I need to be able to make sense of what the parent is saying. I need to ask questions if something's unclear. And then I need to sit back and become a little bit more flexible and not only think my way is the right way. And what I found was in the beginning simulation, at the beginning of the semester and the final simulation, my students demonstrated more flexibility, right? They were just like, I remember some of the students being like, well, this is how I think we should solve the problem, period. To, okay, I'm hearing what you're saying. And are you saying this? Okay, so what we can do instead is this, right? But we need to actually give them the tools and the language to reflect on their own practice. And so throughout the semester, they reflected on their own practice. And so I kind of use this model from TeachingWorks, which is introducing a high leverage practice, preparing them to engage in it, enacting the high leverage practice, and then having them analyze, right? And so I introduced this framework to them. I had them prepare through the use of video, through class discussion, through reflection, and then they enacted the simulation. And then I had them and we analyzed throughout the semester how they use these practices in their video or their first simulation to then improve their practices in the final. So that's a long process. Doing these simulations takes a lot of work. You got to train people and do all those types of things. So next semester, what I'm planning to do is actually focus on the introduce, prepare, and enact phases, but to create a smaller type of simulation. So I want to introduce the high leverage practices of building relationships with students, respectful relationships with students, and communicating with families. For communicating with families, I'll introduce the high leverage practice, right? And then they'll get information about a student, they'll get strengths and areas of need, and they will have to engage in a parent-teacher conference. And they will have to provide a balanced view of the student and also listen to the parents' concerns, right? So they'll have an opportunity to prepare with each other. Then I'm going to ask a colleague, a Black colleague or a colleague of color, to come in and play the parent, and we'll do a fishbowl, right? And that takes a little bit less preparation than the simulation for every single student. And we'll have a few students volunteer to then do what they practiced with a parent in class. And what I would do is I would stop at moments to say, oh, this is what so-and-so is doing. They're listening. And this is an open-ended question that allows the parent to speak. Or I could say, oh, I'm going to stop you right there. You asked a very close-ending question, which is yes or no. And that doesn't open the stage up for the parent to elaborate, right? And so as they're engaging in practice, giving them immediate feedback, and then opening up to the class who was observing in the fishbowl things that they would suggest that their colleague does. And then what we'll do is analyze that practice together. And since communicating with families, our pre-service teachers don't really have the opportunity to do that because they're not teachers yet. A simulated activity, I think, is really helpful there for them. So I'm really thinking about how to just bring the scale down so that it's a practice that I can use every semester with students. And so as I think about this work, I'm thinking about the ways in which my pre-service teachers can really build off familial capital, parents' knowledge of their children, social capital. So parents can tell us their children's social networks, right? And what in their social networks actually inspires them to engage, right? Linguistic capital, right? So understanding that our parents may speak in a different dialect of English than us, but that is still capital because that's the way they communicate. And then we might also, in that, as the parent is talking, depending on the issue that I want my pre-service teachers to really focus on, they might have opportunities to learn about how their student navigates, right, issues of race, right? So the last thing I'd like to add is usually the issue that the parent brings up in the meeting is an issue at the intersection of race and ability status. And in that issue, the student actually engages in resistant capital, right? And to see whether my pre-service teachers can really pick that up or notice that. They don't notice that in the very beginning. And so it takes some work together to do that. And so that's a practice as an example that I plan to use in my class next semester to really support my teachers, my pre-service teachers in noticing this type of capital, right? And so when we do our analyzing the work that we did together, then we're going to go back and say, what types of capital did the parents share with us, right? And so that's a lot to do, right? So I do want to have an opportunity to record when we engage in these practices together, so then we can look back at the video and say, okay, let's focus now on community cultural wealth, right? We focus on engaging in the practice. Let's focus on recognizing the wealth that the parent brings to us. So I'm going to stop there. And if you have any feedback or perspectives, because I would love some feedback on how I can make this better, or if it's just generated some ideas for you or some thoughts for you for your own practice.
We do have some questions in the chat.
Oh, I haven't seen them. Okay. Yeah. Hold on. Thank you. All right, so let's go back here. Oh, yes. Okay. So resistant capital. So when my students did the simulations with a Black parent, when a pre-service teacher, okay, so I'm excited about this. So basically there's certain things that pre-service teachers say, like they all say the same thing because they have limited experience in teaching, right? So when the parent brought up an issue of race, right? When a pre-service teacher says something like, oh, well, I'm going to talk to Mariah and I'm going to talk to the entire class about what happened, the parent will say, no, I don't think that's something that we should do. Right. And so they're resisting the teacher's suggestion. Right. And it's because they want to protect their child, for example. Right. Another example of resistant capital is when students might put their head down in our class. Because one, they may be like, I raised my hand, you haven't even called on me. You don't even see me. Right. Or it could be like, I'm always getting in trouble in this class. I'm putting my head down anyway. Or it could be they're putting their head down because every time they open their mouth, they get into trouble. Right. And so they may resist because something is wrong by putting their head down or talking back or walking out of class. That's resistant capital. And the thing is that we often look at that as negative and we don't really reflect on the why, right? We don't really reflect on like, what did we do that might have caused this child to walk out of class? Or what did we do? Or what did we say, right? That may have caused this child to put their head down. Because often when a child disengages in that way, or even like talks back, right? It's often because there's something that's happening in the class that is exclusionary, even if we don't notice it, right? And so those things are all resistant capital that we typically see as negative, but actually it can inform our practice. Yeah. I hope that answers your question. Okay. How can teachers analyze and critically think about their practices? Do you think a PLC in school would be a good tool, or working with a teacher buddy? I think all of these things would be great. I think what's important though, is if we do a professional learning community or we have buddies, that everybody's working from the same framework. So if we're working from community cultural wealth, or we're working from disability critical race theory, or we're working from disability theory, whatever it is, whatever we decide to do in terms of supporting each other's practice, there should be a framework and language that we're using together. Because at the end of the day, I can't critique your practice or help you improve your practice if we're not talking the same language, speaking the same language. And I always recommend a framework that is a critical framework, right? That asks us to think about marginalization and to think about privilege. Because often frameworks that don't take up this critical perspective kind of leaves that out and is colorblind. And often the things that happen in school happen around language, around culture, and around race, which is color sensitive. You know what I mean? And do you think yeah, I do. And I don't think we prepare pre-service teachers to think of resistance as capital. I just think we don't talk about it. Like, I don't even, it's not even like, I think we're doing a bad job. I think it like falls off the radar. With all the other things that we're teaching, we don't teach about like some of the realities of school. Parents are not always going to agree with you. Kids are going to walk out of your classroom. Like, we don't talk about those things. We kind of have the pie in the sky thing. But I think we need to think about those realistic things and say, yes, a child walked out of your classroom. You feel disrespected. But does that child also feel disrespected? We need to talk, right? To help get our pre-service teachers into a practice of critically analyzing their actions also, right? And sometimes the student is wrong. Sometimes we are wrong. Sometimes we're both wrong, right? But if we don't take up the perspectives of the resistor, we'll have no idea. We're only taking it from one lens. Yeah. So we always have to consider all circumstances of behavior, right? Behavior is a way of communicating, right? If I walk out your classroom, I'm trying to communicate something to you about how I feel, right? And also, like, children are children, even like high schoolers, right? Not all students can articulate, even high schoolers. Like, I feel harmed right now. I can't really explain to you why, but I feel harmed. And so I'm walking out. I can't be in the space any longer, right? And so it actually requires us as, adults, as professionals, as folks who understand that, like, sometimes we can't articulate things, to really come through with empathy and to see resistant capital as a communication to us. Totally. have you done any similar simulations with disability identity first culture? I haven't. So I've just like, I dipped into simulations for my dissertation, and literally that was a 2-year process of developing those simulations. And so I've only created one simulation project, which is around a Black girl, Caribbean American student identified with disability. And the situation or the issue was around a white general education student who's not identified with disability, calling her slow when she came out of her small class, and asked if that's where all the Black kids hang out at, right? And so that was the issue that was the center of that simulation. And so what I'm hoping to do moving forward is to have multiple simulations that work around ability, status, ethnicity, and culture. But it takes time to develop these simulations and train folks to engage in them, because they were in-person simulations. So thank you so much for suggesting that. So I'm working on it. I'm working on it, and I'm really excited about doing that work. So I'm thinking about, for the short term, smaller, more, I guess I'm thinking about simulations that are not as time intensive in terms of planning, but still deep. As I think about learning more about our community in Hamden and New Haven, and getting to know parents and what their issues are, because that can be very different from Michigan issues, parents in Michigan, right? To think about the types of simulations that we can develop around disability and identity first culture, and race and ethnicity and stuff like that. Yeah. Any other comments or questions folks have?
Another question in the chat about using simulations with practicing teachers. And do you know if there's research around that?
So first of all, there's very limited research around using simulation with teacher candidates. So I have yet to find research around using simulations with in-service teachers. But now I haven't looked at the research for a year or two, so there might be something there. So now that's homework for me. But when I was researching simulations not too long ago, all the simulations that actually, the studies that came up were around pre-service teachers, and there are not that many studies out there in terms, particularly using simulations with actual people, which I think is, it could be unpredictable, right? And you get a real feel. Like, I'm telling you, my students actually felt like this was high stakes when it was a simulated activity. So they were really serious about, they came to it really seriously. So there's just really something about like those in-person simulations. But no, I haven't seen any research yet around simulations with practicing teachers, but I can definitely see how, I can actually see like in a school, you talking to parents about their experiences, and then developing simulations based on the experiences of parents in your school. Context really hits home, and having then professional development around thinking about these issues, right? And using parent voices, I think it would be powerful, really powerful. Any other thoughts or questions before we wrap up?
Well, I was just going back to the list that you had, the slide with all of the different kinds of capital. And I just really like that a lot. And I was thinking about the resistant capital and how, at least in my area, working with kids with emotional and behavior disorders, I can relate to this very much, because our students have a lot of oppositional behavior, challenging behavior, and I think you hit it right on the head that we really have to investigate and find out more about just don't shut it down,
Mhm.
because then you'll never get anywhere. So
Right.
we can't shut it down. We have to, go in
Yeah.
and find out what's going on. And I love that that you're asking the question about what is our contribution to that scenario.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering, looking at the other capital that's listed here,
Mhm.
which areas do you think as teachers that we need to investigate more, that we may not, what do you find is most confusing to people, or that we may not be aware of? Um, are they all equal? Is there some place where we need to do more work than others?
I really think we need to do work across the board, but I think what what your question makes me think of is like familial capital, for example. Often our teacher candidates, even in-service teachers, don't know how to draw on that to
Mhm.
then modify their curriculum, for example. Right. So it's like, how do we draw, like when we learn things about students, when we learn things about families, how do we then draw that in like deep and rich ways to impact our curriculum? Not like just like bringing food or like, hey, let's all dress up, you know what I'm saying? Whatever culture it is, right? But
Mhm.
instead say, oh, I teach students of Mexican descent, right? Whose families work in agriculture, right? How might I, in some real deep way, think about pulling in that familial capital into my teaching about science or my teaching about history or etc. Right? I think that's something that's lacking when we are preparing our teachers to either develop curriculum or use curriculum or modify curriculum. I think, oh yes, please.
Can I just jump in there for 1 second?
Yeah.
I I love where you're going with that, and I'm thinking that part of that may have to do with when we think about families, we're seeing the surface stuff and not the iceberg that's underneath, which is 90% of what's going on. So
Mhm.
I'm thinking about the values that a family has and how they view relationships with other people. Um, and you mentioned at the beginning that that certain families, really respect educators, and they may kind of sit back, and you're the educator, and that's your job. And that doesn't mean that they don't have anything to say just because they're polite, right? So I I appreciate very much what you're saying, that we really have to seek, we have to ask those questions.
Because
Mhm.
I remember I was interviewing, informally interviewing some special educators at my old high school. And I asked them about that. I asked them about parent participation. And a number of them were like, they were all white teachers. A number of them said to me, I really don't know why parents don't participate in IEP meetings. And I was like, oh, wait. Are we asking them questions? Are we, you know what I'm saying? Is it this cultural, like, I mean, literally in Trinidad, we hold very high regard for teaching professionals, right? My parents growing up, high regard. So when I went to school and we went to parent teacher conferences, if that's what the teacher said, that's what the teacher said. They don't even ask me like, so what was your perspective? No, 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 no. If the teacher said, the teacher said, do what the teacher said. You don't say that's what it was. And it's because of their high regard, right? For professionals. And I think we should hold teachers in high regard. But I also think that teachers have power, right? And that sometimes blinds us to what we're not seeing, right? The capital that we're not seeing in families. And we make assumptions about why families are not participating or not speaking up, right? Based on white middle class norms, because white middle class people speak up all the time, right? But if your cultural norms are different, it's not because you have nothing to say, it's that you literally, it's a form of showing respect and care, right? And so that's something that we really need to, these are some things we really need to grapple with in teacher education. Totally. So I don't know if we're at the end of our time. Is it 12 o'clock? I know people need to take a break.
Yes, but thank you so much for some amazing discussions and resources. So I put the link in the chat again, so you can share. The Padlet has links to Ebony's presentation, right? And all of the resources that were shared. A reminder, we have a 15-minute break. I put a link to the dashboard. Our final session, we just have one session, and it's a panel of advocates sharing stories of advocacy. So we will see everyone at 12:15. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, everyone. See you soon.